So welcome everybody. Yeah, I'm very happy to be with you, even if I don't see you yet, but I'm looking forward to your questions in about 45 minutes. So Mirko, thanks for the invitation again. And I would like, so we had this title that we agreed upon with Anna, why and how to communicate science, a practical approach. And so practical approach, because I am a practitioner, been working in the field the last 20 years now. And I will have here mainly an angle on two spins. I would like to practical, it's a huge profession. We could talk for hours, but I would like to here focus on two little points. One is storytelling, which will be the second chapter, and one is the use of AI in science communication. But before we go there, I would like to just take a few moments to repeat my vision and why we're doing science communication here. So what is science communication? And then we'll go into these two chapters. And then at the end, as said, we have time to chat. So I would like to start with the science communication slide by showing you this meme that maybe some of you have seen around the web. I don't even know if it's true, but it doesn't matter for the purpose of this discussion. So the Flat Earth Society has members all around the globe. So of course it makes absolutely no sense. Why am I showing you this? I'm showing you this because it reminds, of course, on the version that we had in medieval times that the Earth might be flat. And this was, of course, a theory. But what seems to be wrong when you talk to historians is that it's not true that it was not known that the world was round. It was rather that people didn't spread this information. And so if you look at the basics of epistemology, of this philosophy of science, what is knowledge, right? And knowledge is not only something that is true. So if we know that the world is flat, this is not enough, right? We also need people to believe us if we are the scientists that say the world is flat. And only by having a sum of knowing truths and believing a truth, you actually create true knowledge. And so, you know, I'm showing you this graph because I really want to emphasize the role of communicating science, not only because it's fun, because we have to give back to the people by taxpayers' money, but also because it's actually, in my extreme view, maybe part of the scientific process. Because if you are in a situation where you know certain things to be true and you don't communicate them, they're actually not knowledge. And so the world might stay flat in the vision of many people. So our push in the whole discussion that I have here will be going from the left to the right here. So trying to bring in some communication so that people can maybe trust us, believe us, and thus create a certain form of knowledge. And this is what I call in the larger sense science communication. So activities that connect society and science and trying to get trust and believe and create knowledge in society. So there are many ways to do this. You can inform non-expert people, engage with communities, raise public awareness, and it's not an exhaustive list, but it's basically a whole universe of actors. And you see on the right, there's an image from Wikipedia that used to be also a big role and still is probably by journalists and media, but this has shifted dramatically also now with the socials and with the digitalization. So science communication is not necessarily something new. You know, so you see here images from a few hundred years ago. That's Michael Faraday. Maybe some of you know him, a chemist who used to do some science shows, chemistry shows, and people gathered at ETH in Zurich. They used to do this. I don't know if they still do it. When I was young, they did it over Christmas. They invited all families and children to the ETH, and you could just see chemistry live and explosions and fires and things changing color. And it was really actually a form of science communication, right? Through wonder, you could also fascinate people and give a feeling for science. So in that sense, it's not a new thing. Science communication has always existed, but it has been formalized probably only in the last 60 years or so. And this is a Google Ngram search for the term science communication on Google, on all these scanned books from Google. And you see that basically the term only starts to appear substantially in the 60s, 80s. So I was born there in the 80s. So in my time, it used to become something big. We had more and more TV channels about science all over Europe, inspired maybe by the BBC as well, who had the famous Attenborough nature shows. Of course, TV was also new, right? Early century. And you see the universities, most universities we sometimes forget, like the ETH Zurich, they have been born way before there was a radio or a TV. So they have had a mission of doing science before there were. So for them, for the old universities, which are basically the best ones in the world, right? Berkeley, Oxford, all the old universities, they have gone through many revolutions of information, radio, TV. So the digitalization is just one more. They've always had this task of trying to adapt how to bring information out and in. And so we are living now really in a world where science communication has expanded massively. There's never been so many science communicators in the world as at the moment. There's never been as many scientists at the world as at the moment. It's estimated that 99% of scientists that ever lived on the planet are alive now. Science is in a full expansion. Switzerland has even a minister for science since about 5-10 years. And so in that context, of course, the schools are also demanded to adapt and to bring their knowledge out. And so, for example, on the level of the ETH, this goes even to the fact that in the law of the ETH, this is the law that basically gives the mandate by the state to the ETH, also EPFL, but all the domain. You see that the law states that they have to educate students, yes, A, they have to expand scientific knowledge, B, so research, they have to do other things, also D, provide scientific services, and C, junior staff. So that's, of course, the whole question about young scientists. F, exploit research findings. That would be what we call innovation. But the missions of innovation, research, education are not the only ones. You see that there has been a littera E being inserted in the last decades. You had a little one there. It's new, like innovation. Ensure a dialogue with the public. So basically, it means the state is giving billions of francs to the domain of Research Switzerland with the question, please do education, research, innovation, but also communication. So it's really something that at the highest level is seen as something very important. Now the question is, how do you do that? And you see here, it's also quite phrased well on the level of the law. They don't say, go and tell the people what you do. They say, ensure a dialogue with the public. So they see this, and this is very interesting, I think, to remember that the people who did this law thought further than just pushing information, but really also dialogue, which means also, of course, listen to the public. So it's a two-way street. And I think that's something that we should probably revisit, and we can discuss then in the discussion at to what extent we're actually doing a dialogue or just a one-way communication. Because the one-way communication is what is probably how the field has evolved the last decades, which has been defined in a model that is called the public understanding of science model. The idea that people are not aware that the world is round and that we need to tell them. And once they are enlightened by knowledge and truth, they will understand. And this has, of course, shortcomings that we see also during the last, let's say, during the pandemic. It's not by explaining people what mRNA is that they necessarily get vaccinated more. So there is something more behind this pure rational top-down information, which is exactly the dialogue model. So which has to do with really trying to understand what people care about, how they understand the world, and and having a dialogue. So this is where we are at the moment. University communications are trying to have dialogues. This is not so easy said, because the moment you enter a dialogue, you have to decide on what extent, how far do you basically go to the right in an active form of dialogue? Do you just provide the facts? Do you explain more of the context of your research? Do you even say it has certain maybe results for politics? Or do you even give political recommendations, like in the form of, like in the subject of climate research? But of course, there is a thin red line at some point where it also becomes a form of activism, as we see these days. So you see communication, I'm just ending with this, the first part, touches upon also interfering with politics and policy, and it's not just pure communication. Yes, I stop here with this part. So this was a bit the context of science communication at large. And now, as I said, I would like to deep dive into two practical approaches. And one is a very fun one, which is really the use of storytelling techniques for science communication, which is something that I think in the German world, so including Germany and Austria, but also Switzerland, of course, is a bit underrated. I see the UK and the US, of course, much stronger in this. So storytelling is a big word, but what is it? And I like to open with this quote by a book from Frank Rose, where he's a famous storyteller, and he writes in his book, he cites another book, which is the autobiography of Niels Bohr, you maybe know, a Nobel Prize winner in physics. He used to make these famous quantum walks with his then student Werner Heisenberg. And in 1924, they were walking past a castle outside of actually, I don't know which city, but they are in Denmark. And so he notes this. So the physicist, Nobel Prize winner, notes in his book, "Isn't it strange how this castle changes as soon as he imagines that Hamlet lived here? As scientists, we believe that a castle consists only of stones and admire the way the architect put them together. None of this should be changed by the fact that Hamlet lived here, and yet it is completely changed. Suddenly the walls and the ramparts speak a different language, the courtyard becomes an entire world, a dark corner reminds of the darkness of the human soul, we hear Hamlet's to be or not to be. Yet all we really know about Hamlet is that his name appears in a 13th century chronicle. No one can prove that he really lived here, but everyone knows the questions Shakespeare had him ask, the human death he was made to reveal. So they walk by a castle outside of Stockholm, actually. And this castle is actually the famous place, Elsinore, where Hamlet has been staged in the fiction of Shakespeare. And he says, basically, you see, it's just a castle, right? But it's not anymore just a castle, right? By having put here now in the extreme form a full fiction inside this castle, we suddenly give a different flavor to this castle. And this castle has a quality which is more than just stones and bricks and shapes and materials and arrangement in X, Y, and Z, but it has basically a story that comes along with the castle. And what happens by this is that you actually remember this castle. So, and maybe some of you, maybe this happened to some of you too, when you're on holidays, you visit, touristic spots, churches, mosques, and maybe in some of them, something happened that made a story out of this place. Maybe you had a fight with your girlfriend or boyfriend, maybe your kids had to go to the toilet. And then suddenly this anchors yourself in memory. And this is actually the power of story. Right? Story is, if you want, is more than data. Data is what we do when we do a PhD, when we do research. We gather these bricks, stones, we describe the material, how many of them, we arrange them in X, Y, and Z. But story means adding a layer to make this accessible to people and being reminded by people. There is also research on this, and actually by the Hasson Lab. And they actually they take the purest form of stories, if you want, which is movies. And they show movies to different people. And they look at their brains. And they don't interpret the brains. There is a lot of reproducibility issues with psychology interpretation of brain scans. But here it's pure correlation. So they do something like a correlation pattern, which they call IEC, which means intersubject correlation score. So they look at, do the brains spike in the same way at the same time, without interpreting. And you see that when people, on the bottom left, when people look at a very well-structured movie like an Alfred Hitchcock, up to 70% of the people spike at the same time, which doesn't mean now what is happening, but you can imagine what's happening. They're afraid at the same time, they laugh at the same time, they surprise at the same time. While if you show them any segment of the reality at the extreme end, right end, it's basically zero. If I show you a really, really bad movie or just something I randomly filmed, maybe you will think of what to eat tonight. Somebody else will write to his partner somebody else falls asleep. So the brains are in different modes. So that shows actually the power of story. Stories are able to bring people to the same attention. And you feel this when you're in a cinema. A good structured story brings everybody to the same attention. And by this, it's like opening a channel. And by this, it allows to transmit information, which is more than just the data. And in the ideal case, as I said before, it allows us to remember. So storytelling is really a powerful tool that we don't use enough in science, I think. It's actually a vehicle, if you want. It's how to transmit a copy from left to right. Right here you have a comic of somebody who has an idea, and then you want a replicate of this little light bulb on the right side in the receiver. And you can use text, you can use music, you can use films, but at the end you need a vehicle that then transmits this thing. And this is actually the story. So this is the sender-receiver problem, if you want, for those people interested in computer science. And that's also what the early days of digitization actually were. Right? The father of digitization, if you want, Claude Shannon, he was really trying to understand how can I send a copy of something from A to B. That's what led to the bits and the image, the pixelization and the copies of images around the web. So basically, how to transmit this. That's why computer sciences in the States are also called communication sciences, by the way. So can we do this also with science when we do communication? And yes, we can, but it needs, of course, to understand a bit what a story is. And here I just break it down in short because we don't have much time. But a story is something that has in the center somebody, a protagonist, who basically wants something. And often for certain reasons, X and Y, they can't have what they want. And this leads to a certain conflict and attention, which we as spectators want to see resolved. We want to know how does the protagonist go about solving his conflict. And that's where the story is born. So this little triangle is actually what creates a story. And it's if you manage to bring in your bricks, your castle into this kind of pattern, this creates automatically, as we said before, attention, interest, and memory. So when it comes to your science, what does that mean? It means, okay, let's assume you're a climate scientist. Then you ask yourself, what is my protagonist? That's why I'm giving you this applied tool in my way. So is your protagonist the world? Is your protagonist the human? Is your protagonist the CO2? Who are you talking about in this story? And you see already at that very high level that sometimes the messages are mixed up. I see daily newspaper articles where I'm not sure if it's about the planet or the human. Are we dying out or is the planet dying out? It's not the same thing. As a biologist, I would say the humans are dying out, not the planet. But we often say the planet. So the storytelling is not very proper. And so, you can tell the story from 3 different angles. But what does humanity want? Probably survive. What does the planet want? Maybe something else. What does the CO2 molecule want? So it's in your hand as a storyteller to rephrase these things. And when you have these tools, when you know you have a protagonist, you have a conflict, something that you want, a desire that you can't have. So humanity wants to survive on this planet, but unfortunately CO2 is accumulating, creates a tension. How do we get out of this? You are actually creating a story, a compelling narrative. But then you can, of course, go wild, and I don't want to go there now because then else we would really be making movies. But with these elements at hand, with these little things, and I give classes on this and workshops that go from 1 to 2 full days. How can you transform your science into a story? There are endless forms then, here to cite Darwin, but you need to know a bit the basic elements, which I just throw at you right quickly. There are certain elements more, of course. One is the story structure. The other is what type of protagonist do you have in your story? Do you have a hero? Do you have a mentor? Do you have a wizard? Do you have a trickster? Do you have a shadow? So it all goes back to really ancient humanity ways of working. Storytelling is here since the dawn of humanity, and it's a code that we use to talk to each other. So it has been clustered, if you want, by sociologists and historians and storytelling experts, and you see that they came up with these kind of prefixed solutions where they tell you, okay, look, your protagonist can be the hero, it can be a trickster, it can be a mentor. So the question, of course, if you narrow it down to science, becomes, well, what archetype is the scientist? Is the scientist a hero? Is the scientist a shapeshifter, a herald, a trickster, a mentor? And again, these are things we discuss in the workshop, and there is no true or wrong here. It's really a framework to think about communication. But what is very obvious if you look at the past is that in the most things we consume, the scientist is actually usually the mentor, the magician, the wizard, and you see this in all the big movies. So the scientist is always, unfortunately, also here old white male. Actually, this is typical also for stories. They are very slow evolution, right? So this will take a long time, but luckily we're slowly going there until we have young women being archetypes. In society, we have it luckily more and more, but until the pattern is away in our primitive brains will take time. So often you see the scientists here are always depicted a bit as old white male, like in mad scientist kind of flavor. And this reveals a bit that actually this is, from a storytelling point of view, we're expecting scientists to be this kind of type. But again, this was just maybe a side comment. But this leaves us with kind of setups that you want to maybe use when you do communication. So you can say, okay, the scientist is the wizard, right? Can also be a young female, but still it's a wizard. It has the flavor of solving solutions, of using tricks, of using engineering, of using magic. But then the question is, well, who is the hero? Because you cannot have a story without a hero, right? So, okay, that's a framework. Maybe I want to communicate in that way. Or I communicate with the scientist being the hero in the center, and I leave away the wizard. Or I try both. And this is just 3 formulas, and there is hundreds that you can imagine as combinations, but 99% of the stories are told in that way. And I would say, and the argue here in this first part is that usually the best story is when you have a hero that is close to society. So when it's about the planet, you have somebody who is close to me, who is maybe now in a planet where it's very hot. I can relate to it, to my country. Maybe here it's too hot at the moment. And the scientist comes in as a wizard trying to help as a solution. This is not the way we tell stories in science. Remember, every paper says we show, or no, we, the scientists. That's option B. In science, usually we put ourselves as heroes in the papers, which is totally correct for scholar communication, but it's not necessarily how you want to transmit the information towards the outside. So with the same, again, bricks and elements, you go from B to A. I would say a lot of the job of a person doing active communication is transforming a story B, a scholar paper into a story A. I show this example here. That's an example where exactly you have a paper. There was a EPFL, a paper which has in the center on the left, published in Nature Medicine. We, the scientists, show that we can restore paralysis in people injured in paralysis, right? When you transform in the communication, you transform it into A and you put at the center not the hero, the professor, which is there in the back, but you take the two at the front, the patients, and you transform them and you tell they are, he on the right, for example, David Mzee, is a basketball player, wants to play basketball, had an accident, couldn't play basketball anymore, right? It creates a tension. And now comes in the wizard, if you want. And so you transform the story and make it much more powerful, right? You can do the same thing with many stories. And of course, there are other options. I showed you before, A and B, but there is also just A, where you can say, I want to put in the center right away another object. Here, for example, a walking robot. So again, you have a scientist saying, I developed a robot that can walk on 4 legs. And in the news, you put the robot in the center in the Alps, and you let people assimilate with the robot in the center. That looks a bit like an animal. It's a bit like when you use cats or dogs, and people get more interested. Okay, I won't spend too much time here. Maybe just that you see a bit these structures, right? Sometimes there is the scientist and the hero. So there are very rare cases. This is Nancy Wexler, who has a disease, which is genetic, is a researcher, and researches on the same disease she has. So here she's basically the protagonist of her own story and the wizard trying to heal herself. But just that you see these structures, right? I think it's important that we think about these things. And I really pledge for people who want to do communication to take a bit of time at the beginning and reflect about these things before you go into writing a text, a structure, setting up a table of content, or writing it out. And this, like all the rest, can now, of course, be prompted also with AI. So I would also use AI if you want. For example, you give your paper to AI, a large language model, and you ask him, come up with different storylines, spins, put a different protagonist in the center. What would be the conflict? Use storytelling tools with AI to come up with a story. What is the real story? What is the best story for me to convey information? How can I make somebody remember the castle, right? And that's the exercise. And this is something I'm really, really convinced about. That, again, as I said in the beginning, it's not developed enough, I think, in Europe. Most people I've seen go immediately into writing, structuring, a text without thinking of structure. So talking about AI, of course, you also have to know, and this is, of course, and you know it probably, but it's another talk, but it's important that you're aware of the biases of AI. We all know, we're learning this as we go. If you generate an image, a scientist in the lab, you get, again, surprise, surprise, an old white male. If you want a young Asian female, you have to say a young Asian female scientist in the lab to get the right image on the top right. So these biases, we're learning them, luckily, but they're in the code. And the same is, of course, for storytelling. If you they will also always try to tell the same story again, and you need to be aware of those things. So I'll stop here the first part of the 2 practical approaches, but I really try to say that storytelling is a powerful tool if you want to learn to convey a good story before you write a story. And I'm obsessed with it since a child. I actually did myself also movies. And I just recently in March, I wrote a long article about Oppenheimer, the movie, which in the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, which was really about this interference of movies and science. For those who are interested, maybe you can look it up. Okay, so that would really be one of the 2 elements for me. So using storytelling tools. The other would be, of course, AI. We already touched upon it. AI can be used to try to narrate a better story. But of course, AI is in the rise much more than that. And I would just quickly here remind you what happened. So AI has not been here since 2 years. AI is here since a long time. This is back in 2015 or so. We all remember these weird memes again, where you don't know if it's a chihuahua or a muffin, and you have to click on all the chihuahuas in order to get your password back. And this has been in 2015. In 2015, we all started really understanding or seeing AI coming. 2015, why 2015? Because 2015 was actually the year where AI, in terms of image recognition, became as good as the human. And this is an important lesson, I think, that we need to know. AI is never perfect. It's only always comparing to ourselves. In the sense of, here the task has been, can you recognize a cat? And thousands of researchers, computer scientists tried to solve this already back into 2011. You see on the far left, and you see that back then they managed with 74% correctness, but there was a 26% error rate. So if I gave 100 images, 26 were mislabeled as cats or dogs. The human has an error rate of 5%. Again, these images are not so trivial. If I give you thousands of these images, you also will make errors. So AI, proof of principle of image recognition, has been around, if you want, since 13 years or so here. But only in 2015, it touched the red line. And it became same, if not now better than humans at recognizing images. And so that's where we heard the first time. That's why we had all to change our passwords. But this is the story of AI, and that's why I want to recall it a moment. As typical for research, AI has a proof of principle and has an optimization phase. Proof of principle started for image recognition early 2009, we said here, according to our word and data, and then touches this human level around 2015. Speech recognition much earlier, or in 2000, handwriting recognition. And you see language understanding came very quickly, but it also came not out of nowhere. It took a few years. And you see that the slopes here are getting steeper and steeper as we go. So as typical for research, the first development takes much more time than the last. So the first vaccine took hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, depends how you count the beginning. The last vaccine was done in 6 to 12 months, the mRNA vaccine, right? So you build on the shoulders of giants on knowledge. So AI is increasing in speed, but still there is always a difference between proof of principle and getting to the red line. Same with the cars. Self-driving cars, they're around since a few years now, but still they're not coming, right? We always feel, yeah, because it's really, the red line has to be statistically significant. Once somebody manages to prove that they are safer than humans, they will come, right? So the thing that happened last years is actually not AI. What happened is large language models. What happened is that these models came that simulate language, that if I give a sentence like the sun is, that then they predict the next best word. So if I tell you the sun is, you also think immediately of bright, yellow, hot, right? And this comes with certain probabilities. And so it's not so, this is actually a principle of how large language models work. Given an input, they take the next probable output. And this output is just words. And of course, these words can also be turned around. That's why these machines can also be cynical. If I tell if I tell the AI to be cynical, then it will maybe say the sun is cold, black, right? So it takes the lowest probability words and it suddenly becomes a bit like slapstick or strange fun. So it's just words that actually are numbers. And that's what it gets really crazy now, that we have kind of an easy time to understand that the cat is nothing else than a number of pixels, right? If the cat would be black and white, we would have just, and you zoom in on a computer, we would have just 0 to 255 numbers, right? 0 to black. And words a bit more tricky, but it's the same principle. At the end, if I type the sun is, I'm just typing numbers. The machine doesn't see names, words. It just sees numbers and predicts numbers. And so it's purely high-level statistical prediction. And the crazy part is that by pure numbers, not words, you still get an output that is kind of logical, has a sense of grammar, has even a sense of psychology now. There is knowledge inside, right? And these large language models, they have knowledge inside not the database, inside these vectors, right? They're not looking up on Wikipedia. They have inside their knowledge the words with a certain probability. So there is not much code, a lot of training, no real databases, and still something that mimics something that is very human. And so it's again lots of data. And so what happened is then we went from, the same happened for images. We went from a world where a computer could recognize a dog just by seeing at the pixels. It doesn't see a dog, right? It just looks at the statistical occurring of pixels and says this order of pixel you call a dog apparently. So it tells you it's a dog. But this happened in 2015, and the machines have been trained so good that now the last 2 years they start to tell you, well, I can do you a dog actually if you want. I can throw the pixels on a white canvas that you call a dog, right? So now that's the generative part. It cannot generate only text, but they can also generate images. But I think it's much more than that. And I want still to remind us that it's much more than about images and text. It's also about language in general. And language doesn't mean necessarily only German or English. It's also Python, C++, right? So these languages can translate. You can translate anything into any form of language. That's why there's a good coding. But there's also the language of amino acids. There are so many papers coming out where they predict virus variants, for example, for COVID, or in materials, the language of atoms. So there is every month there is new publications. Actually, just yesterday in Nature again, a publication about molecules based on AI. So it's actually language is all around us, right? If you want, science is understanding the language of nature at large. And I think we should not forget that one thing of this generative AI is what we use every day in the office, words and text. But actually, the big thing that will be probably much more transformative to science will be the language of science, the prediction of vaccines, the prediction of future virus variants, the development of new antibiotics, new materials, which is all happening as we speak. Okay, but in the language sense, I think for communication is probably what we use, because communication is language. And so there, of course, we use the large language models. Maybe you know this board here, this ranking, which you can look up, and every day is always changing. And you see that the best are actually GPT-4o at the moment and Gemini by Google. These are the best tools available at the moment with the most parameters and tests passed. And so very good tools. These tools are a bit funny, certain, like ChatGPT, which is by OpenAI. So there has been just, I think, 2 or 3 days ago in Nature, this article where they assess how open actually is open. And you see that the OpenAI is not really appearing here on this list. Open means, can I access the code? Can I see the data that is trained with? Can I see how it is weighted, the words? Is there a preprint behind? Can I access through a program interface? And the only real open one, actually, of the big ones that we know is actually Mistral, the third one, right? The 2 top one, we don't hear often about them. But Mistral is the European contender. For those of you who know, there is one big AI company in Europe on the large language model, and it's from France. It's called Mistral, and I strongly suggest that you use it. And the other one is all at the bottom, Llama by Meta, and of course Google Gemini at the bottom. They're also somewhat open, as you see. This is more on a political note. Okay, so large language models are here. Large language models are now something we can use for communication, also an applied way. How to use it? Well, before I go a bit into a few examples, I would really like to cite here Ethan Mollick, a professor from USA, who's posted last year this quote, which I like a lot. The best use of AI is in your narrow domain of expertise, where you can understand its limits and values. I think whatever you do with AI, don't do it if you don't know the result. I would never do accountability, financing, or optimization of jogging if I'm not a jogger or an accountant person, right? In communication of science, I know what I'm doing. In storytelling, I know what I'm doing, so I use it. And so I think this is a bit the limit of AI, is because else you don't see when the hallucination happens, right? You don't recognize when it's a fake. How can you know what you don't know? This is an old Greek principle, and it will stay true. So if you stay inside your domain, I don't know what it is in your sense, health maybe, then you can use these tools and try to convey health in a more accessible way to an audience by using LLMs. But you always know when it is wrong, right? So, and this brings me to the fact that universities are actually starting to use these things in the last years. You see here 2 surveys from 23 in green and 24 just came out these days in Germany. And you see that universities in Germany are actually using to 80% DeepL for translation, right? Of course, we all do. But you see for the other things like, doing slides, generating images, Midjourney, using ChatGPT, the bottom, it's moved from 22% to 59% in 1 year. So it's really expanding now, but the majority of them are still not using it, right? So in communication departments, people are not using AI much. DeepL, of course, but DeepL is not really generative. It's more like translation. But ChatGPT is on the rise extremely fast. Some say ChatGPT is the fastest growing social network. It's not a social network, but it's just extremely quickly expanding. And that's also the reason why I gave lots of workshops the last year at university departments. I toured nearly all universities to teach them these tools. And so they're learning it as we go. Learn to do what? Well, as university, what do you do on your daily basis? I mean, you see it here. It's exactly the same thing, right? You make slides, you make text, you make images. That's exactly the work of a communicator. Create presentations, write texts, make communication plans, social media analysis, summarize meetings, try to understand the science of the scientists, do news, generate maybe images or change images. So these are the tools, the jobs that communicators do every day. And as you saw here, these are exactly the tools that are now doing this. So I expect these lines to go to the right over the next 1-2 years, even stronger, and change the way we do communication. Now I give you a few examples of how you can do things. This is an example from my little, just to show you, you can also analyze your own tweets, social media analysis. So here I downloaded all the tweets of my account, which was on Twitter X. I started in late 2013, as you see, and you can just download all the data, give it to ChatGPT and say, hey, can you plot it for me? And then it shows you here how many likes I got, and you see how it nicely increased in number of likes until Elon Musk arrived and the whole thing went down. But you can do data analysis without having to code. I can say, zoom in to 22 and tell me what are the most relevant topics. And it will do some kind of natural language processing and tell me in 22, you had mostly talked about AI, about science communication workshops, about celebratory messages, congratulating researchers, about science news in general. It's exactly what I did. I can ask the machine, well, when was the best post? Well, it was usually at 9 o'clock in the morning or at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. All these things that usually you had to buy tools, Falcon, you had to analyze, or you could know how to analyze just by having my language, right? I talk to the machine and it translates it not into French, but into Python maybe, makes the calculation and comes back, right? So I see here really an incredibly useful way of becoming more data-driven in science communication. But then on a more, maybe more fun level, there is also, of course, images. Here I like to cite Marcel Salate, a professor from EPFL, who a year ago made a very nice post about the impeding budget cuts in science research and education. And he was looking for a good image, right? And so he came up with this image on the right, which is generated with Midjourney, where he represents Swiss science and innovation as a little light bulb, a bulb that is at the limit of switching off, black clouds coming, the budget cuts, in Switzerland, the Alps. So such an image is really an image that is very strong. It's an image that speaks more than 1,000 words. It's an image that has also flown quite well, up to 300 likes. And so this kind of imagery, if 2-3 years ago, if I would have had to make an image like this, I would have had to pay hundreds, if not thousands of francs to a graphic person or have somebody inside to do it. Now you can do it with the click of a mouse button, right? Maybe an hour or two, okay, but you can generate very significant images. But you need the idea. And the idea of this image is also something you can do with large language models. As before I said, you can use these tools to generate a storyline. You can also generate with them ideas. What image would you use to convey that innovation is threatened by the budget cuts? And so this is 1 year ago. I cite this a lot because I really think there is something hidden that we can use. And just this week, actually, The Economist cover, maybe you've seen it, The Rise of Chinese Science. What do they have as a cover? A light bulb with Chinese little lamps, you see. And I don't know, people don't declare and don't have to in most countries if it has been done with Midjourney, AI, or if it has been done in traditional ways with the graphics people. But you still see that if you look a bit around, maybe now that you've heard me talking, scan a bit the images that you see, and you will see more and more images that might have been done with Gen AI. And this is very interesting because it opens a visualization world that can go very far, I think, for science communication. I was also seeing recently there has been approvement of this treatment against sickle cell anemia. Maybe you've heard it. The FDA in the US allowed for the first time to use the CRISPR-Cas9 method that won a Nobel Prize to treat humans. And then the question is, how do you display fixing blood red cells in the blood? Go with the camera inside the blood. Tricky. You need a graphist who draws them or a 3D rendering. Well, I see lots of images with red blood cells now circulating that my guess is they have been generated with AI. So images can also be modified. This is a friend from the domain. You can have a picture and I can say, change me this picture. He used to be actually a basketball player when he was young. So this has been done in 2 minutes in Photoshop. I can just change him and make him again a basketball player in 2 minutes. I can take away his t-shirt if I want, and I can give him back his legs and put him on a basketball court. Image modification is also something that's happening, and it's not unuseful. People are not using it so much yet, maybe more in the press than in communication, but you have often images that you sometimes need to repeat on your website, and you can modify it with AI. You can also tell full stories. I give a workshop of 2 days at University of Zurich where I work with PhDs for 48 hours, and they try to convey their science into a communication, and they use AI here as well. It's an AI workshop. And so here you see Serain Oberli from University of Zurich, who works in structural biology, who really developed a whole comic for kids about structural biology. Here's another student, Marijn, who tried to make a comic of gluten disease. I don't show you the whole thing, but with various tools, Here is just me transforming my language into Italian, you know, hey Jen. So all I'm trying to say here is that these tools are basically working on language, they're working on image, they're working on video. And I think they're, in that sense, very powerful to start to transform our messages, simplify our messages, find the right images, change the right image, maybe even generate the right image. All this to do a step further in this dialogue with the public. So I would like to close here slowly and maybe just as a summary, tell you what I was trying to convey to you. First of all, I was trying to tell you what science communication is and why we're doing it and how, as a dialogue. I was trying to tell you that storytelling is a powerful technique to convey a clear narrative towards the audience and that AI can be used for that too. And then, of course, in general, that AI is now here since a year or two in the form of large language models. It has been here before in different models, but in large language models, and communication is 99% based on language. There we can also now start to use it and craft and try to convey the message of science communication and bring out information better. And with this, I would like to close and thank you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.